Throughout history, governments around the world have been involved in secretive operations, many of which have caused public outcry when they came to light. Some of these covert projects, shrouded in mystery and controversy, involved unethical experimentation on both civilians and military personnel. These experiments ranged from psychological manipulation to biological testing, often crossing ethical lines in the name of national security, scientific progress, and military advantage. While the general public may have been unaware of these secret experiments, many have been uncovered and revealed decades later, shedding light on the darker side of governmental power and the potential abuses of it. In this exploration, we will examine the most notorious secret government experiments, analyzing their purposes, the methods used, and the long-term consequences for those involved. From the infamous MKUltra program to the shocking Tuskegee syphilis study, these experiments expose the chilling realities of power, control, and the willingness to sacrifice human rights in the name of progress. Chapter 1. The MKUltra program. One of the most infamous government experiments in history is the CIA's MKUltra program. Running from the early 1950s to the 1970s, MKUltra was a mind control program that sought to explore methods of altering the human mind for purposes of interrogation, intelligence gathering, and even military advantage. The program was initially conceived in the context of the Cold War, with the fear that Soviet agents were using mind control techniques on prisoners of war and spies. The nature of MKUltra project is often remembered for its use of psychedelic drugs, particularly LSD, on unsuspecting individuals. The CIA's agents administered these drugs to both volunteers and non-consenting civilians, including soldiers, prisoners, and mental health patients, without their knowledge or consent. The goal was to see if the drugs could be used to alter brain functions or create a Manchurian candidate, a person who could be controlled and manipulated. The project involved numerous sub-projects, including tests on sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and the use of various chemicals and substances. It is believed that over 150 human experiments were conducted under the MKUltra banner, with little to no ethical consideration given to the participants. The aftermath and exposure. In the 1970s, MKUltra was officially terminated following a series of investigations into the program. The public was shocked to learn that the CIA had conducted mind control experiments without consent, and in some cases, subjects were subjected to long-term psychological damage. The full scope of MKUltra's activities was difficult to ascertain, as much of the documentation was destroyed by the CIA in 1973. However, through congressional hearings and declassified files, survivors and victims of MKUltra came forward to share their harrowing experiences. Chapter 2. The Tuskegee syphilis study. Tuskegee syphilis study is another example of a dark chapter in the history of government-sponsored experimentation. Beginning in 1932 and continuing for 40 years, this study was conducted by the U.S. Public Health Service to observe the progression of untreated syphilis in African American men. The subjects, who were mostly poor sharecroppers from rural Alabama, were never informed of the true nature of the study. The study's beginning Tuskegee study was initially marketed as a way to treat bad blood, a term used to describe various medical conditions in African Americans, including syphilis, anemia, and fatigue. The researchers did not inform the participants that they were studying syphilis, or that the disease was left and treated in order to observe its progression. Even after penicillin became the standard treatment for syphilis in the 1940s, the men in the study were denied access to it. The deception and cruelty. Deception continued throughout the study. The men were told they were receiving medical treatment, but in reality, They were only given placebos or ineffective treatments. Many participants suffered severe health problems and died from syphilis-related complications. The study continued until 1972, when a whistleblower exposed the unethical practices to the press, leading to its cessation and widespread public outrage. Long-term effects. Tuskegee study caused irreversible harm to its participants and their families, leaving them traumatized and marginalized. In the wake of the scandal, the U.S. government was forced to offer reparations to the victims' families, and the case led to significant changes in how medical studies are conducted today. The event also sparked reforms in medical ethics, including the requirement for informed consent in all clinical trials. Chapter 3: The Manhattan Project and Radiation Experiments. During World War II, the U.S. government initiated the Manhattan Project, which led to the development of the first atomic bombs. While the scientific achievement was groundbreaking, the government also conducted secret radiation experiments on unsuspecting citizens and military personnel. These experiments sought to understand the effects of radiation exposure, often with little regard for the safety or well-being of the participants. Radiation experiments on unwitting citizens. In the 1940s and 1950s, several experiments were conducted on civilians without their knowledge or consent. One of the most notorious examples occurred when the U.S. government injected people with radioactive isotopes without their consent, often under the guise of medical treatment. In some cases, pregnant women were injected with radioactive iodine, while children were exposed to radiation through various medical tests. Many of the individuals involved in these experiments later suffered from cancers, tumors, and other debilitating conditions. Radiation testing on soldiers. U.S. military also conducted dangerous experiments on soldiers, exposing them to nuclear radiation without informing them of the risks. Thousands of service members were involved in atomic bomb tests, often stationed in close proximity to the blast zone, to observe the effects of radiation exposure. These soldiers were not informed of the hazards, and many later suffered from radiation sickness and various cancers. The aftermath and public outcry. In the years following these experiments, the public grew increasingly aware of the dangers of radiation and the government's unethical testing practices. Many of the victims of these experiments never received adequate compensation for their suffering. However, the exposure of these tests led to increased oversight of human experiments and greater accountability for the government. Chapter 4: Operation Paperclip. At the end of World War II, the United States sought to gain an upper hand in the Cold War by recruiting former Nazi scientists who had worked on advanced technologies, including rockets and chemical weapons. This secret program, known as Operation Paperclip, brought over 1,600 German scientists and engineers to the U.S. despite their involvement in Nazi war crimes. The recruitment of Nazi scientists. The United States government ignored the scientists' past affiliations with the Nazi regime, instead focusing on their potential contributions to the development of American military and technological power. Among the most famous recruits were Werner von Braun, who helped develop the U.S. space program, and numerous other scientists involved in chemical weapons research, biological warfare, and human experimentation during the war. Ethical and moral dilemmas. Operation Paperclip represents the moral compromises made in the pursuit of national security. By overlooking the scientists' roles in Nazi atrocities, the U.S. government not only tacitly condoned the actions of these individuals, but also allowed their dangerous and often unethical research to continue. These scientists were granted immunity for their involvement in war crimes, and many of them continued their work with few questions asked. Chapter 5: The Legacy of Government Experiments. While many of these experiments were halted, after they were exposed. Their legacy continues to affect the individuals and families who were subjected to them. The psychological and physical toll on the victims is immeasurable, and the public's trust in government institutions was severely damaged. In response to these atrocities, several measures have been put in place to ensure greater transparency and ethical oversight in research and experimentation. Ethical guidelines and reforms. U.S. government instituted several reforms following the exposure of secret experiments. The most notable of these is the National Research Act of 1974, which established a requirement for informed consent in medical and scientific research. The Belmont Report, issued in 1979, outlined ethical principles for human subjects research, emphasizing respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. A call for accountability. These reforms. The history of government experiments serves as a cautionary tale about the abuse of power and the vulnerability of individuals caught in the crossfire of governmental interests. The damage done by these experiments cannot be undone, but acknowledging these wrongs and ensuring such violations are not repeated is essential for building trust in scientific research and government institutions. The dark history of secret government experiments reveals the extent to which governments have gone to achieve political, military, and scientific advantages, often at the expense of innocent lives. From the McUltra program to the Tuskegee syphilis study and beyond, these experiments remind us of the fragility of human rights and the potential for abuse when power goes unchecked. It is only through transparency, accountability, and a commitment to ethical practices that we can prevent history from repeating itself and ensure that the rights of individuals are always upheld.